When I started Conlanging, we had this website, the Language Construction Kit by Mark Rosenfelder, and it was great. It's still something you can use. There's plenty of good information there. The website got turned into a book, and that book got sequels, but it was still just sort of an informal guide. Then we got David Peterson's The Art of Language Invention, also a very nice little starter book, but it's more of something to pique your interest in conlanging rather than to teach you how to do it. And that, plus a lot of community resources and recommended linguistics books and papers, that was what we had. But as of last year, we have a formal textbook. This is How to Create a Language, the Conlang Guide by Jessie Peterson, and it is a college-level textbook published by Cambridge University Press. This copy was sent to me by the folks at Cambridge. That's my hack for free books. You run a relevant podcast for a decade and then find the email for the press department. Don't do that, just buy it. Or find it in the library. Jessie Peterson was a professor at Stephen F. Austin State University for 13 years, during which time she often taught a course on constructed languages where each student created their own language as part of a course-long project. Now, she and her husband, David Peterson, who I mentioned earlier, are full-time professional conlangers and game designers. Peterson has created many languages both on her own and with her husband for personal use and professional projects. And you will see lots of examples of those in this book. Now, I feel I wouldn't be entirely responsible if I didn't tell you that I've known Jessie for years. We watch each other's stuff, we've been in the same collaborations, and I've interviewed her several times, both by herself and with her husband, and about the writing of this book. I am in the acknowledgments of this book. That said, the Conlang community is small, and there's a fair chance I'm going to be in the same circles as a conlanger writing a textbook. And I'm going to tell you, a strength of this book is that it comes from within the community. Let's dive in. The first two chapters of the book are titled Natlangs and Conlangs, and they cover the basics. Natlangs lays out what a natural language is, and includes a very well-developed section on language evolution, better than a lot of intro linguistics books. And there's a good reason for that. Jessie and David Peterson are very much into the historical method of conlanging. And while you can go through all the exercises in this book without doing any historical work, the book does repeatedly encourage you to use historical methods. We'll be coming back to that later. But remember, this is not a linguistics textbook. As Peterson writes in the preface, this book introduces students to best practices of conlanging and introductory linguistic concepts before tasking them with making decisions about their language project. The primary intended audience is undergraduate students taking a constructed or invented languages course, though sections focusing on more advanced conlanging strategies make this book a potential resource for graduate students taking a similar course. Readers don't need to be in a class to find this book useful. Any reader interested in constructing a language for the first time or honing their conlang skills can use the information in this book. She does go on to say that the book can serve as part of an introductory linguistics class, but to my mind, this is a conlanging textbook. Its goal is to teach you how to make languages, and the real linguistics presented is in service of that goal. This is made very clear in the second chapter, Conlangs. This chapter gives an intro to the history of conlangs, defines the difference between a priori and a posteriori conlanging, and dives into the three major types of conlangs, auxlangs, englangs, and the focus of the book, artlangs, which is what you will learn how to make. After that, there is a section on common misconceptions that people in the community will recognize, delineating properly developed conlangs from language games, relexes, and ciphers, and a section about maintaining consistency, and then this under approaches to conlanging. Peterson identifies three levels of conlanging goals: the aesthetic goals, which means surface level aesthetics of how the language is meant to sound; typological principles, which means application of linguistic typology to approach what she calls a naturalish conlang; and finally, evolutionary development, shown as the deepest level, where the conlanger actually starts from an earlier version of their language and simulates its evolution into its modern form. Let's hear what Peterson says about this level. This approach results in a naturalistic artlang appropriate for both professional and personal projects. Decisions are informed by aesthetics and typology, but are further rooted in historical development of the conlang and based on natural tendencies of language change. Hence, the importance of understanding how natlangs spread and develop within language families. Irregularities within the conlang have connections to the historical changes selected and described by the conlanger. The end result is a language that very much looks and feels like a natlang and is a professional grade conlang. Now, a note. When Peterson says professional grade conlang, you need to know that she and David Peterson are the only two full-time professional conlangers I know of. Other conlangers have taken on clients here and there, but they're full time. They're doing this all the time. Point being, if anyone can tell you what a professional grade conlang is, she can. However, I do have some opinions on the historical approach being on its own placed at the deepest level, but I'll come back to that later. I take chapter 2 of this book as an introduction to what I would call Conlang Theory. This is the apparatus that is informed by linguistics in the way that color theory in the visual arts is informed by human color perception, or music theory is informed by mathematics and acoustics, but is also about the artistic tradition and philosophy. Conlanging in its current form is a very young art, but just like visual artists and musicians have developed a lot of cultural layers to their art, we also are developing a cultural discussion within the conlanging community about what makes a good conlang, how do we apply real linguistics, what are the genres of conlangs. Giving so much ink to an introduction to conlang theory, and especially contributing something that seems to be new in these levels of conlanging goals, makes this a conlanging textbook and not a linguistics textbook. Anyway, the second chapter ends with some helpful tips to get started, and then we get to the meat of the book. From here, I want to zoom out and talk about the broader organization, which I think is also informed by the goal of primarily being about conlanging. The book is organized into three sections: building words, constructing grammar, and expanding features. Building words contains the two intro chapters I've already gone over, and then continues with the chapters sound inventories, phonotactics, phonological shifts, and basic vocabulary. Starting with phonology is, of course, the classic approach to conlanging. And so that's what those first three chapters are all about: the inventory, phonotactic rules, and then sound changes that can either add allophony or be part of your historical development. Basic vocabulary then helps you to determine the basic words of your language. That is, the core words that are not borrowed and are not known to be derived from other words. Basically, building words lays out the foundations of your language. The chapter's sound inventories includes an introduction to the International Phonetic Alphabet and even includes a reduced chart of the cross-linguistically most common sounds. I like these reductions a lot, as I think they keep beginners from getting overwhelmed or making kitchen sink languages, where you just cram in every weird change you want. These initial chapters introduce quite a bit about how world building affects your language where appropriate. Sound inventories has information on how non human speakers may have physiological limits to the sounds they can pronounce. Basic vocabulary has an extensive discussion on world building. Indeed, Peterson calls this out in section 6.2, stating this chapter differs from the others in the book because its primary focus is world building rather than linguistic features of languages. I definitely don't think most intro linguistic books have a chapter on basic vocabulary. The Squirrelish and Leipzig Jakarta lists mentioned might make it into a discussion of historical linguistics, but beginning linguistics education often doesn't focus all that much on the lexicon or the connection between culture and language. Here, it is upfront because conlangers must have this in mind. You are building the culture and the world alongside your language, so you absolutely need to make some world building decisions. So we have sections about what environment your speakers live in, how they meet their basic needs, and what their culture looks like. I feel we have a good balance of the world building information you need going into conlanging without losing focus on the language itself. Part 2 opens with a basic grammar chapter, which helps students to make choices on both headedness and basic word order. Something that caught my eye in this is that Peterson encourages conlangers to make simple sentences to test different word orders now before deciding on inflections. This approach interested me mostly because it contrasts with my own process. I generally want to have a lot of my inflectional morphology done before I start making example sentences so I have a more complete idea of the structure. Peterson, on the other hand, encourages more of an iterative process. Start with this simple analytic sentence, then revise as you add inflectional morphology. There are several times in the book where she advises conlangers to revise their previous work, and I think I might consider implementing some of this in my own process. After all, it's not like I don't revise things, it's just that I make myself think I'm done only to come back later and retcon something that isn't working, like when I completely changed how comparatives work in Ndakaga after producing a Conlang feature video. Accepting iterative development from the start might make more sense for a lot of people and maybe prevent some of those late changes that can end up being more disruptive. Sure enough, this section continues with the chapter Inflections and Grammaticalization, which gives a very solid explanation of the different morphological types, as well as lexical sources of affixes and function words. This step, coming after basic word order decisions, is important because Peterson mentions how that decision affects where inflectional affixes attach, and the discussion of grammaticalization further reinforces the usefulness of a historical approach. The next 4 chapters are devoted to the essential lexical categories nouns and verbs. Peterson covers all the inflectional categories you expect: number, noun class, and case for nouns, and tense, aspect, mood, and agreement for verbs. There are some interesting choices in the organization here. Most notably, one chapter is entitled Pronouns and Verb Agreement. Whereas in some contexts you would separate pronouns from verbs, this chapter, putting them together, is a useful functional classification. There's a big focus on how pronouns and agreement marking work together and share similar functions. One caveat is that I think Peterson is slightly too strong on the idea of pro-drop being linked to agreement marking on the verb. You can have significant argument dropping without agreement. It's just less common that way. Minor lexical categories, that is, adjectives, adverbs, determiners, and adpositions, are briefly introduced in basic grammar. These then get expanded on in the subsequent chapters throughout the book. It makes a lot of sense that these would be gradually developed in relation to other things. Adjectives and adverbs are completely optional as distinct categories, And determiners and adpositions definitely need to be discussed in the context of nouns. The final section of the book is titled Expanding Features and aims at building more advanced and complex structures and preparing the language for further development. The first three chapters here are all about grammar, word formation, cover strategies for expanding the lexicon beyond basic vocabulary, compounding, derivational affixes, conversion, polysemy, and borrowing. The next two follow up with complex sentence structures and complex modifying structures to flesh out the language so that it can handle everything that NatLangs can do. These chapters are very thorough and well thought out. I particularly like this diagram on page 320 breaking down all the ways to combine clauses. Suffice it to say, you'll come out of these with a good idea of what options are available for structures like relative clauses, comparatives, etc. Chapter 16 is all about orthography and includes information on creating a romanization, creating an original orthography, and also on adapting an existing orthography to a language as if it had happened naturally. Peterson is very clear on the difference between a romanization that is external to the world of the language and an adaptation of an orthography that aims to represent your speakers naturally adopting it. And there are examples of both. More on that in a minute. The final chapter is something I would like to see in any conlanging textbook that comes out in the future, a chapter on translation. It's a short chapter with a handful of translation examples, but I think it's very valuable just for the emphasis it places on continuing to use a language. Here is how Peterson talks about translation and its function in helping further develop your conlang. Everything you have done so far is like drawing a two-dimensional sketch. The lines are drawn, the scene is visible and recognizable, but without shading and color, it lacks a certain amount of depth. Using a language is what gives it a third dimension. Translating texts, even small ones, into your language is one of the best ways to expand your work. It's worth mentioning that Peterson also highlights the work of translation in her professional conlanging. Translation is the bulk of the work David Peterson and I do as professional conlangers, and it is through translation that our languages come to life. No two languages align perfectly in vocabulary or strategies to create meaning, so translation requires careful consideration of intended meaning and ways to convey that meaning that suit the language, its speakers, and their world. Now, most people reading this book will probably never have a professional conlanging job, but I think it is valuable to highlight that most of that job is being a translator. When you create the language, you become the canonical source for that language, and that's where they need you. Also, studios and whoever is hiring conlangers, the translation is important. Things go real bad if you don't bring in the conlanger for translation and instead give the job to writers who aren't competent in the language. But most importantly, translating and composing texts is definitely where the language comes to life. You will find words and structures you never realized you needed, and you will get into your speakers' heads in a way you just can't while you're constructing the grammar itself. Even more, it's an important social component of the hobby. Conlangers love translation challenges, including the tradition of conlang relays, which viewers of this channel should know about. Now that I've talked about the overall structure, I want to talk a little about the examples and exercises. Peterson pulls examples from both NatLangs and Conlangs, covering a diverse range of both. Many of the conlangs are from the many, many conlangs that she and her husband have created both individually and together as a team. But I see plenty of languages I recognize from the community popping up, including Ithquil, Itlani, Alursa, Brithanig, etc. The conlang I see most often is Peterson's personal language, Juadi. which shows up a lot in case studies throughout the book outlining her own creative process. In terms of Natlangs, we see some favorites. English, Finnish, German, and Spanish show up quite a bit. But there are a wide variety of languages from tons of varied language families, as you should expect from any linguistics textbook. In addition to all of these examples, each chapter includes a discussion of a language created for the book called Squirrelish. It is a language of North American squirrels who mysteriously gain a human like vocal tract and the capacity to use language. Squirrelish is a major part of the exercises in each chapter. From chapter 4 on, there will be exercises to work on constructing a version of Squirrelish, followed by exercises for the reader to construct the same structures in their own language, or in some cases, discuss their decision not to use a particular feature. Squirrelish is also used throughout the book as an example of how to explore and make decisions about your language. My favorite Squirrelish section is actually in the orthography chapter, where after developing a romanization and an in-world English-derived orthography, Peterson then adapts the Cherokee syllabary for a population of squirrels living on Cherokee land in Oklahoma. She even mentions listening to Cherokee speakers to get a range of realizations for each glyph and assigning unused glyphs to Squirrelish syllables that don't exist in Cherokee. Someday I will be making videos on how to adapt an existing writing system, and I don't think I can top that idea. Now, most of these exercises are fully expected from the content of the chapter. Here's number marking. Now let's decide what number marking looks like in Squirrelish and your language, and on and on. But at the end of chapter 15, which wraps up all the grammar construction, there is a nice little extra exercise on naming both Squirrelish and the reader's Conlang. But Peterson doesn't reveal her own name for Squirrelish until the exercises for chapter 17 as part of a mini Conlang relay exercise. So there's a little surprise to look forward to. Now let's take a step back for a bit of critique. I do really like this book, and where I have gripes, they're mostly nitpicky things that I'm not going to bore you with. There's some things that literally every book introducing linguistics will do that I'm mildly annoyed at, but that's just because I have a PhD and that curses me with opinions. I will point out that Jessie has more teaching experience than me, so I can defer to her on a few things that I don't get. There's also the cases where I run into a language I'm familiar with and don't 100% agree with the analysis in the book. That'll happen anywhere. The few places where I think there was an actual mistake are not really things that impact the value of the book too much. I'm sure lots of notes have been taken for the second edition should we get one. A couple things I will mention. There were times when I think we could have had more Natlang examples. It's important to have both Natlang and Conlang examples in the same way that an artist should both draw from life and study the work of other artists. And there are plenty of Natlang examples to be had, but there were times when one particular section had only Conlang examples, and I thought we could have had a Natlang in there. One example was in the advanced section on tonogenesis. The Wokothishu example is good and seems to be based on well-known principles of tonogenesis, but I'm not entirely sure about the naturalist of the Menishe example, and there are a few Natlang examples I could think of to introduce different types of tonogenesis. I do totally understand the density of Conlang examples. It is a book about conlanging. Plus, Peterson has a huge number of conlangs she herself has created at her disposal. Not only is she more familiar with those, but it's going to be easier for her to get clean examples to demonstrate with because she can literally create them herself. I just think here and there we could have switched out for a Natlang for some more grounding in a couple of sections. Another thing, and this is more of a what if than a real criticism, is about the romanization section. I understand why it was put near the end with orthography. And It generally is good practice to save original writing systems for the end, but I think it could have been possible to introduce romanization a bit earlier. Having it together with orthography can help draw the distinctions, but there may be some people who would like to switch to romanization after they've got a decent idea of their basic word shapes so as to be working with something a little easier to read and type. When I initially wrote and recorded this video, I had a whole criticism written up about the 3 levels of Conlanging goals, and I rewrote it several times. I thought it was good, then I recorded it and listened back, and it was like, sounds good. Then when I think about it, it's not right. I ended up rereading that section and realizing I was kind of missing the point. That framework does work pretty well for the goal of this book. It is pretty good for naturalistic conlangs, if that is your goal, which that's all it needs to be good for. I still think that like historical development is like not the only thing that goes into the verisimilitude of the conlang, but this was also under a heading of approaches to conlanging, and the other things I was thinking of are not necessarily like a broad approach to conlanging. There are other things, other facets that many of them are actually mentioned in the book. So instead of that, I'm mentioning this about how I am continuing to process what I read, and there we go. With all that said, I really like this book. It is a well-designed and thorough introduction to conlanging. If you are a professor who is teaching a conlanging course, I highly suggest you consider this book for your class. If you want to buy it for yourself, I'll have the link to the book on Cambridge University Press and a few other places to buy books down below. And now that I've got that done, this is going to go up on my shelf. Thank you so much for listening. How to Create a Language by Jessie Peterson is a good book. I highly suggest it for any beginning conlanger, or even for people who've been doing it for a while and want a different perspective. Meanwhile, there was another conlanging textbook that came out last year, and I'm going to do a video about that. It's going to be a very different tone. Big thanks to all of my patrons on Patreon, which should be appearing on screen right now. If you want to support the show, maybe hopefully get to where I can make more videos like this, go there. And lowest tier is $1. Higher up, you can get early videos. There you go. And thank you all for watching, for likes and subscribes and all of that stuff. And I'll see you in the next one. Happy conlanging.